The 27-inch iMac was killed off a lot faster than we all thought yesterday, and Apple's terminology near the end of the keynote was basically that there's only one Mac left for them to transition, and as people were bringing up in the comments on yesterday's video, they kind of took that as, oh, so it's just the Mac Pro that's left. Essentially, the way Apple is kind of laying out their plans, it sounds like they don't have any future iMacs that need to transition over because, yeah, that Intel one is gone. So technically, as uneventful as it may seem, all iMacs have transitioned to Apple Silicon, and that's because actually all iMacs have the M1 chip now, and all iMacs have white bezels. And yeah, that 24-inch iMac that I've been so passionate about in the past is pretty much the only iMac now on the site. So what does that say for the future of the iMac line, and is there any hope for an iMac Pro revival? Let's begin. So the iMac holds a very dear place in my heart. Some of the first computers I ever used were an iMac. It was introduced by Apple the same year I was born. That's how I get half of you to all go, oh god, I'm old. Why am I watching this kid's YouTube channel? But I grew up with the iMac line, and I still use an iMac Pro every day. Granted, a lot less because I have my M1 Max MacBook Pro now, but still, I think it's an awesome machine, and I've always loved the concept of having an all-in-one design that is your display, that is the computer, that is the speakers, that's the microphone, the camera. I'm all in favor of that style of minimalism. But if you remember during the Mac Studio unveiling yesterday, Apple was kind of comparing it and pitching it as a replacement to both the 27-inch iMac and even the cheese grater Mac Pro, which even Apple is admitting now, like, yeah, that thing's not worth it anymore. So I think this is partially because Apple has seen a fundamental shift in the uses of desktops these days, probably because laptops no longer have as many compromises as they used to. You know, in the old days, you could get a whole lot more performance out of a desktop, and if you went with a laptop, you had to deal with, you know, battery life and underclocked specifications. But thanks to the ARM transition, now you're able to get the M1 Max chip, which is already insanely fast, into a laptop that still has amazing battery life, and Apple's probably seeing that most people are opting for laptops these days, unless you're running a studio. You have a home office, or you're a small startup or a small business of some kind, and they've realized that the only people really going towards that desktop market now are less likely to care about minimalism and simplicity because they have a bunch of tools that they gotta use with these products. If it's being used in the studio, they're gonna have microphones and cameras and lights and lots of different external monitors with different display settings, and basically they went all in on, okay, if you want something more high-end than the 24-inch iMac because the M1 chip isn't cutting it for you, or you hate the white bezels and chin, well then you should just get the studio display, you know, get a different monitor and have something with a lot more performance like the M1 Max or M1 Ultra, and just kind of customize it the way you want. They are actually leaning more into kind of the modular market, not necessarily open up the computer and start working on it, but plug in lots of external accessories. That's why Apple was happy to brag about how many ports are on the back of the Mac Studio, whereas we look at the 24-inch iMac, it's almost as if Apple is saying, most of the ports on this thing aren't going to be used anyway. Like, yeah, they slapped the headphone jack on the side because they're like, most people have AirPods, but I guess we should throw in a headphone jack. And on the back, you know, on the cheapest option, there's only 2 USB-C ports to choose from, and that's pretty much it, because any other legacy ports probably wouldn't fit in a design that thin. And I think this might just be how Apple views all-in-one desktops now. That's what the iMac was kind of all about, and now Apple's like, well, if there is someone out there that wants an all-in-one design, they're probably an everyday consumer. They're not in the studio. They're not necessarily a professional that wants a bunch of external accessories and external hardware. They just want a Mac that basically, you know, does FaceTime, I can send text messages, I can browse the web, and as many of the fans of the 24-inch iMac have said, it's basically just meant to look good at a reception desk, because it's meant for, like, you know, checking people in on the website of whatever business bought this iMac. So maybe that's made Apple feel like the idea of a higher-end iMac that's at a 27-inch or 32-inch screen size, or an iMac Pro, if you will, is no longer super-duper necessary. I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only one. There's gotta be tons of you out there that are like, hey, I'm like a studio guy. I have a business at home, or I do videos at home, and I would still like a clean all-in-one iMac to buy. I'm like interested in the better performance, but that doesn't necessarily mean I want this big old toaster sitting on my desk, and I don't want to have to buy a separate $1,700 studio display. You know, before, when the 27-inch iMac was around, there was technically a way, you know, before the Apple Silicon transition, to get like a $2,000 machine with pretty good specifications, pretty decent I/O, and it was still all powered by a single cable. You had your monitor, your machine, all there together. It's an interesting direction for them to take, but I have to feel like it has to do with something about Johnny Ive departing and how Apple in the Mac line is kind of leaning a tad more into functionality and less so design preferences. That's why Apple seemed to be so comfortable bringing back legacy ports on the new MacBook Pros, which honestly most of us thought would never happen, and now we're seeing Apple lean more into, you know what, let's just let the customer choose what monitor and keyboard and mouse they want to use. Let's let them make their own perfect setup. We don't need to try to come up with the perfect recipe of all these products together. But recently, analysts like Ming-Chi Kuo have actually said to expect the iMac Pro in 2023, and it's no longer expected to come out in 2022 at all. This might be because Apple is having a hard time getting a hold of mini LED displays and they're unable to scale them up at a large enough size as much as they would like, or maybe all of the mini LEDs are going to be dedicated to the Pro Display XDR refresh, which is inevitably going to launch directly alongside the Apple Silicon Mac Pro, and they're like, hey, we don't have enough of these displays to go around, so we're going to prioritize refreshing the Pro Display since the Studio Display just came out. Hopefully that means cheaper, but still has, you know, local dimming zones and great dynamic range. And as much as I would love to say Pro Motion with 120 Hz, unfortunately, looking at kind of the specifications of what Thunderbolt 4 can handle, it seems that 5K resolutions or higher are basically capped at 60 Hz. So Apple's either going to come up with Thunderbolt 5 or their own proprietary monitor connection, or have to go with HDMI 2.1 or something like that in order to get a Pro Display with a refresh rate that high, or they're just going to decide that 120 Hz is restricted to MacBooks and iPads for some reason because those displays are soldered in. They can get away with it easier. Seems a little bit unfair in my view as well, but I just don't think Apple's the type of company to start supporting 2 Thunderbolt ports into the Mac and 2 Thunderbolt ports into the display in order to maintain the throughput you would need for a refresh rate and a resolution that high. But I don't think most of us out there would be against the concept of an iMac Pro. Maybe it still has a chin, maybe it doesn't. That doesn't really matter. Just the concept of mini LED like a Pro Display XDR, but you bake in the M1 Max or the M1 Ultra into this all-in-one design and maybe throw in the Pro stand because this thing's gonna be expensive, and then you just have this ultimate all-in-one iMac that's more powerful than the cheese grater Mac Pro, but the display is built in, and because it's built in, just like it is on a MacBook Pro, you wouldn't be limited by the throughput capability of Thunderbolt 4. So what I'm trying to say is the only way to achieve mini LED and 120 Hz on a single device that's, you know, bigger than a 16-inch MacBook Pro might be going through with an iMac Pro in the future. I'm bummed to hear that they pushed it out further into 2023, but considering that what studios and what professionals really want is something like the Mac Studio where they can dock it with whatever they need to dock it and there's more control given there, makes me feel like, yeah, in today's world, in today's culture, most people are just going to be buying laptops, and the only people buying all-in-one desktops are the average consumer, are the people who like the 24-inch iMac, which is a bit of a bummer because I remember not too many years ago we had like 3 different iMacs to choose from on the website. You had like a 4K and 1080p 21.5-inch iMac, you had a 27-inch iMac, and you had the iMac Pro. Now we've gone from like all these different options to one. And it's kind of weird. It doesn't really look like any of the old ones, and it's not trying to push itself as a productivity device that much. It says a lot about how Apple has shifted their focus in the Mac market, and I guess it really just comes down to, do you think this shift is a good thing? I ultimately do think it's the right move to acknowledge that, yes, there's a lot of people out there that don't necessarily need a 5K display, and the fact that there's now going to be a very affordable and easy access to the M1 Max chip, so people don't have to spend $3,000 on a 14-inch laptop anymore to get that kind of performance, and they can dock it with their existing monitors. It doesn't necessarily mean they have to spend $2,000 on a new one, even though it potentially means Apple might not get as much revenue in the end. So not the reality I thought Apple was going to go with, but an impressive one nonetheless. And at the end of the day, I'm still very hopeful that maybe at some point in 2023, perhaps next year's March event, once the Intel transition is finally done, that's when Apple might get more creative and just start making really beefed up, super powerful iMacs that have all that great dynamic range and the great refresh rate, and of course, center stage, or maybe even throw Face ID on there. Still have the great studio mics, the great speakers. It comes with the Touch ID keyboard, and it could still put Ethernet in the power brick if they want to, but I think this is still going to be a much thicker iMac at the end of the day, and hopefully, Apple is just comfortable with not having a chin on that thing. But at that point, it might be so drastically different from the 24-inch iMac. Do you think there's even a point in having both? I think there's still going to be a market for it, and you'll just have to be patient if that's what you were waiting for. But feel free to let me know what you guys think is going to happen with the iMac line down in the comments below. This is your Apple Sheep here. I'll see you all in the next one.